The astronovus shuddered as it broke through the thin veil of Charon's exosphere, its retro-thrusters firing in rhythmic bursts to slow its descent. Through the reinforced observation windows, the crew caught their first glimpse of the icy moon's surface, a barren, frozen landscape etched with endless ridges and fractures. Faint sunlight spilled across the jagged terrain, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch toward them like spectral fingers. Commander Elena Voss leaned forward in her seat, her gloved hands gripping the armrests tightly. She had trained for this mission for years, but now that they were here, her stomach churned with unease. The desolation below was haunting, beautiful in its starkness, but unnerving all the same. It was as if Charon itself resented their presence. "Landing zone secured," announced pilot Jacob Price, his voice steady but tense. "Prepping for final descent." Dr. Malik Chen, the team's exobiologist, peered out the window beside her. His face was pressed against the glass, his breath fogging up the visor of his helmet. "Hard to believe anything could come from this place, let alone a signal," he murmured. "Yet here we are," replied Dr. Nadia Vega, the geologist, as she fastened the straps of her harness. She glanced at the monitors displaying seismic data from their orbital scans. No tectonic activity, no volcanic heat. This place is as dead as a moon can get. And yet, that signal shouldn't exist, finished Malik. But it does. The astronovus touched down with a muted thud, sending a shiver through the hull. The crew exhaled collectively, though the relief was short-lived. Charon's silence, broken only by the hum of the shuttle's systems, seemed to press in around them. Elena unbuckled her harness and stood, her boots clanging softly against the metal floor. "We've got a 24-hour window, let's move." The airlock hissed open, and the crew stepped onto Charon's surface. Their boots crunched against the brittle frost, the sound unnervingly loud in the stillness. Above them, Pluto hung like a ghostly giant, its faint light giving the landscape an otherworldly glow. The camp was established quickly, a cluster of modular tents connected by insulated corridors. Inside the main dome, portable heaters fought against the biting cold as the team set up their equipment. Outside, the drill team worked tirelessly, cutting through the thick ice layers to pinpoint the source of the signal. Beneath the surface, their instruments detected something extraordinary. "Commander," Nadia called over the comms, her voice sharp with excitement, "you're going to want to see this." Elena donned her helmet and stepped back outside, the cold immediately seeping into her suit. She trudged across the ice to the drill site, where Nadia was hunched over a console. Her eyes flicked up, and Elena could see the barely contained excitement in her expression. "What have you got?" Elena asked. Nadia gestured at the screen. "We've hit something, a structure. It's massive, Commander, and it's not ice, it's not rock either. It's metallic." Elena's gaze shifted to the pit where the drill had stopped. Faint reflections of light shimmered deep within the hole, as though something below the surface was alive. "Depth?" she asked. "About 2 kilometers down," Nadia replied. "We're hitting material that's, well, alien." Alien. The word hung in the air, heavy with implication. "Continue drilling," Elena ordered, her voice steady despite the knot tightening in her chest. "I want full scans and samples as soon as possible." The hours stretched into a blur of activity. Nadia's team uncovered more details of the structure, perfectly angular lines, massive in scale, etched with symbols no one could decipher. The signals they had come to investigate grew stronger, pulsing like a heartbeat. Every member of the crew felt it, a low vibration that seemed to resonate not just in the ice, but in their very bones. "It's not random," Malik said late that night, his voice trembling as he examined the signal's waveform on his monitor. "It's deliberate. It's trying to communicate." "Or it's a warning," Jacob muttered from across the room, his face pale as he stared out the window. "Maybe we shouldn't be here." Elena turned toward him sharply. "We're here to investigate, not speculate. Stick to the facts." But as she said the words, doubt gnawed at the edges of her mind. Something about this mission didn't feel right. The signal, the structure, the eerie silence of Charon, it all felt wrong, as though they were trespassers in a place they were never meant to find. On the third day, the drill team broke through. The pit yawned open, revealing a vast, hollow chamber beneath the ice. The crew lowered a camera into the abyss, its lights cutting through the darkness. What it revealed made Elena's stomach drop. Beneath the surface was a doorway, a perfect hexagonal entrance etched with alien glyphs that seemed to shift and shimmer when viewed from different angles. The walls around it pulsed faintly, as though alive. "Commander," Nadia said, her voice barely a whisper. "We've found it." Elena stared at the image on the monitor, the doorway glowing faintly in the dark. She didn't know what lay beyond it, but a cold dread settled over her as she spoke the words that would seal their fate. "Prep the team. We're going in." The descent into the hollow beneath Charon's ice was slow and nerve-wracking. The crew's lights cast long, trembling beams across the alien walls as the lift descended deeper into the void. The air grew colder, almost suffocatingly so despite the insulation of their suits. Every sound, every hum of their equipment, every scrape of the lift against its guide cables felt intrusive, as if the structure itself was listening. When the lift finally stopped, they found themselves in a massive chamber, the ceiling soaring so high that it vanished into darkness. The walls shimmered faintly, their surfaces lined with alien glyphs that seemed to pulse in rhythm with the signal. At the center of the room stood a monolithic structure, its surface smooth and black, as if carved from obsidian. It exuded an unsettling presence, a weight that made Elena's skin crawl. "It's enormous," Dr. Malik Chen whispered, his voice cracking over the comms. He stepped forward, his scanner trembling in his hand. "And it's not just metallic. There's organic material here, complex, multi-layered." "Partially alive?" Commander Elena Voss asked, her eyes locked on the monolith. Malik nodded. "Alive, but dormant. I've never seen anything like this." Marco Alvarez, the team's engineer, knelt by the base of the monolith, his gloved fingers brushing against the surface. "This isn't just a structure," he murmured. "It's a machine." Nadia Vega moved closer, her eyes wide as she took in the intricate patterns etched into the monolith's surface. The glyphs glowed faintly beneath her flashlight, their shapes shifting as though responding to their presence. "If it's a machine, where are the controls? There's no interface, no input. It's just waiting." Elena swallowed hard. "Let's not get ahead of ourselves. Focus on documentation. Malik, keep scanning. Nadia, map the chamber. Marco." Her words were cut off as Marco pressed his hand flat against the monolith. The glyphs flared, their faint glow erupting into blinding light. A low, resonant hum filled the chamber, vibrating through the floor and into their bodies. The air grew thick, heavy with static electricity. "Marco!" Elena shouted, grabbing his shoulder. "Step back!" "I can't." Marco's voice broke off as he gasped, his head snapping back, his helmeted face tilted toward the ceiling, his body trembling violently. The monolith pulsed, its light synchronizing with the rhythm of his convulsions. A sound erupted from the walls around them, a deep, guttural resonance that felt more alive than mechanical. It wasn't random. It was a voice, an alien voice speaking a language they couldn't understand, yet somehow felt in the marrow of their bones. Then Marco collapsed. The hum subsided, leaving an oppressive silence in its wake. The glyphs dimmed, their light receding until the monolith was as black as it had been before. Elena knelt beside Marco, her heart pounding as she checked his vitals. He was breathing, but his skin was slick with sweat, and his body twitched uncontrollably. "What the hell just happened?" Nadia's voice trembled as she backed away from the monolith. "Did we activate it?" "I think it activated us," Malik said, his face pale. He was staring at his scanner, which was filled with erratic, incomprehensible data. "The signal. It's not coming from the monolith anymore. It's in the structure. It's everywhere." Elena stood, her gaze darting around the chamber. The walls were no longer still. They pulsed faintly, their surfaces rippling like liquid. The glyphs seemed to slither, their patterns coiling into shapes that made no sense, shapes that hurt to look at. The oppressive weight of the monolith's presence had spread, filling the chamber with a suffocating pressure. "Commander," Malik whispered, "we've woken something up." A sound like breaking ice echoed through the room, followed by a faint, wet slithering. Elena's flashlight swung toward the source, but nothing was there. The sound grew louder, coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. The walls seemed to breathe, their surfaces distorting as if something beneath them was trying to break free. "Back to the lift," Elena ordered, her voice firm despite the fear clawing at her throat. "Now!" As they turned to leave, the floor beneath them buckled, throwing them off balance. Marco groaned, his eyes fluttering open. But when he looked at Elena, she recoiled. His pupils were gone, replaced by a swirling, iridescent pattern that mirrored the monolith's glyphs. "It's inside me," Marco whispered, his voice layered with an inhuman undertone. "It's speaking to me." "Get him up," Elena barked, pulling Marco to his feet as the team scrambled toward the lift. The walls were shifting now, their surfaces bulging outward in grotesque, fleshy shapes. The glyphs were no longer faint. They burned brightly, filling the chamber with an unnatural light. As the lift ascended, the chamber below erupted in chaos. Tendrils of dark, organic material burst from the walls, writhing like living things. The monolith pulsed with blinding intensity, its hum escalating into a deafening roar. The guttural alien voice filled the air again, louder and more insistent, as if it was calling out to something far beyond Charon. The lift reached the surface and the team stumbled out, gasping for breath in the frozen air. But the nightmare wasn't over. The ground beneath their feet vibrated, and the ice surrounding the entrance to the structure began to crack and shift. Something was rising from the depths. Elena stared in horror as the monolith's light erupted from the fissures, illuminating the icy wasteland. The signal was no longer a faint pulse. It was a roar echoing across the surface of Charon like the cry of a predator that had just awoken from a long, hungry sleep. The camp was no longer a sanctuary. The bitter cold of Charon's surface seemed almost welcoming compared to the oppressive dread that had settled over the team. The hum of the monolith's activation followed them, faint but ever-present, like an unshakable whisper at the edge of hearing. Even in the insulated warmth of their habitat domes, the crew felt exposed, as though invisible eyes watched their every move. It began subtly, almost imperceptibly. Malik Chen was the first to notice, though at first he said nothing. The whispers started when he was alone, faint murmurs that carried the unmistakable lilt of his daughter's voice. She had died 2 years earlier, a tragedy he had buried beneath work and ambition. But now her voice was clear, undeniable, calling to him from the edges of his consciousness. "Daddy, why did you leave me?" He snapped awake in his bunk, drenched in sweat, his heart pounding. The room was silent except for the steady hum of the life support systems. Yet, as he looked toward the corner, he swore he saw movement, a fleeting shadow gone before he could focus. Across the camp, Marco Alvarez sat at a workstation, staring blankly at the schematics he was supposed to be analyzing. His hands trembled as he scribbled glyphs onto a pad of paper, symbols that he couldn't remember writing but felt compelled to reproduce. His breathing quickened. The room seemed smaller, the walls closing in. When Nadia Vega walked in to check on him, he flinched, nearly knocking over his chair. "Marco," she said softly, eyeing the glyphs with unease. "Are you okay?" He shook his head. "It's in my head, Nadia. I can hear it, feel it. The structure, it's alive. It's trying to change me." She didn't know how to respond. She had her own fears to manage, strange sensations creeping over her skin, as though something slithered beneath it. She'd written it off as stress or the cold, but the sensation was growing worse. That night, when she looked in the mirror, she saw it. Faint crystalline patterns spreading across her forearm, glinting under the dim light. She covered it quickly, her heart racing, refusing to acknowledge what it might mean. By the third day, the team was unraveling. Malik's hallucinations grew more vivid, his daughter's voice accusing him, her cries turning into screams. He began talking to the air, begging her forgiveness. Marco became increasingly erratic, mumbling to himself in a language no one could understand. The glyphs he drew seemed to glow faintly, as though they were alive. And then there was Jacob Price. Always calm, always composed, the mission's pilot began pacing the corridors like a caged animal. His paranoia escalated until he accused Nadia of sabotaging their equipment. When Elena intervened, he rounded on her instead. "You brought us here," he shouted, his voice shaking with rage. "You knew something was wrong, and you still pushed forward. You've killed us all." Elena stepped back, her hand instinctively moving to the knife strapped to her thigh. "Jacob, get a hold of yourself." But he didn't. He lunged for her, and it took both Nadia and Malik to pull him off. In the struggle, his helmet cracked against the corner of a console, and he slumped to the floor, unconscious. They carried him to the medbay, but the damage was done. Trust had fractured irreparably. Elena retreated to her own quarters, her composure slipping. She hadn't told the others about the vision she'd been having, about the flickers of movement in the dark, the fleeting glimpses of impossible shapes just beyond her field of vision, about the voice, low and ancient, that whispered to her in her dreams. "You are small," it said, "insignificant. You were never meant to find us." She clutched her head, trying to block it out, but the voice only grew louder. It wasn't just in her mind. It was everywhere, resonating through the walls, the ice, the air itself. She felt the weight of the entity, its presence pressing down on her, filling her with a despair so profound it threatened to crush her. In the days that followed, the transformations began in earnest. Nadia's crystalline growths spread across her body, her flesh hardening into a grotesque, shimmering armor. She hid it as best she could, but when Marco saw her removing her glove to reveal her fractured, glass-like fingers, he screamed. "You're becoming one of them," he shouted, backing away. "It's in you. You're infected." Before Elena could intervene, Marco fled the dome, stumbling out into the icy wasteland. The others scrambled to follow, but by the time they found him, it was too late. He was kneeling in the snow, his helmet removed, staring up at Pluto's pale light with a serene expression. His face was frozen, the alien glyphs carved into his skin as if burned there. Elena dragged his body back inside, her hands trembling. They were falling apart, one by one, and the entity was winning. Malik was next. He had been quiet since Jacob's outburst, retreating into himself. When Elena checked on him, she found him in the lab, his chest exposed. The skin over his ribcage was bulging unnaturally, something writhing beneath it. His breathing was shallow, his eyes glassy. "It's inside me," he whispered, tears streaming down his face. "It's growing." Before she could stop him, he grabbed a scalpel and drove it into his chest. The sound he made, a guttural, inhuman scream, haunted Elena long after his body went still. Now there were only three, Elena, Nadia, and Jacob, who had awoken with no memory of his outburst, but a deep, gnawing fear in his eyes. They huddled together in the central dome, the walls creaking around them as if the structure was alive. "We can't fight it," Nadia said, her voice hollow. The crystalline growths had reached her face, her left eye now an opaque shard. "It's already won." "No," Elena said, her voice firm despite the terror that gripped her. "We're not dead yet. There has to be a way to stop this." But even as she spoke, she felt the truth in Nadia's words. The entity wasn't just in the monolith or the structure. It was in the air, the ice, the very fabric of this moon. It was in them. The camp was no longer recognizable. The walls of the domes had become translucent, webbed with alien growths that pulsed faintly like the beating of a great heart. The structures that had once been their sanctuary now felt like a trap, the entity pressing in on all sides, suffocating them. The air was heavy, saturated with the low-frequency hum of the awakened monolith, a sound that seemed to burrow into their skulls and nest there, fracturing their thoughts. Commander Elena Voss stood by the airlock, staring out at the desolate expanse of Charon. The fissures in the ice had widened, spreading across the surface like veins, glowing with the same unearthly light that now emanated from the monolith far below. The landscape was alive with motion, tendrils of black organic material creeping upward from the cracks, twisting and writhing as though searching for prey. Somewhere out there, in the abyss below the surface, the entity was growing. Behind her, Jacob Price and Nadia Vega were preparing the explosives. They worked in grim silence, their faces pale and drawn. Jacob's hands trembled as he wired the charges, his movements jerky and imprecise. Nadia had to guide him, her crystalline fingers glinting in the dim light. Her transformation was nearly complete. The alien growths had consumed most of her body, her flesh now a grotesque mosaic of glass and tissue. Yet she worked tirelessly, determined to see the mission through to its bitter end. Elena turned back to them, her jaw clenched. "We don't have much time. The monolith's reach is spreading faster than we anticipated. If we don't blow the structure now, it'll consume the entire moon, and us with it. Jacob looked up at her, his eyes haunted. And what happens if we succeed? What if destroying it just wakes it up more? Elena hesitated. The thought had plagued her since they'd formulated the plan. There were no guarantees, no way of knowing if their actions would contain the entity or unleash it further. But they had no choice. If it reached Earth, it's a risk we have to take, she said firmly. Either we stop it here or it spreads. And if it spreads... She didn't finish. She didn't have to. Nadia's voice cut through the silence, hollow and tinged with resignation. It's already too late for me. Elena turned to her sharply, but Nadia held up a hand, her crystalline skin catching the faint light. I can feel it, Commander. It's in my thoughts, my body. I'm not me anymore. Not entirely. I'll finish arming the core charges and detonate them manually. No, Elena said immediately. We'll set the timer and... There's no time, Nadia interrupted, her voice steel. You and Jacob need to get to the Astronovus and initiate the launch sequence. If this thing spreads to the ship, it could use it to escape Charon. You have to get out of here. I'll stay. Elena's chest tightened. She wanted to argue, to refuse, but the truth was written all over Nadia's face. Her transformation was accelerating. The alien entity was using her body, warping her into something unrecognizable. If she didn't stay behind, it would compromise everything. You're sure? Elena asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Nadia nodded. I'm not afraid anymore. Just make sure it's worth it. Elena stepped forward and clasped Nadia's crystalline hand. It was cold, unyielding. Thank you, she said, her voice breaking. Jacob avoided Nadia's gaze as they left the dome. The two survivors moved quickly across the ice, the glow of the monolith pulsating behind them like a malignant star. The tendrils writhing from the cracks seemed almost aware of their presence now, shifting toward them with eerie precision. Jacob stumbled once, letting out a choked sob as he scrambled to his feet. Keep moving, Elena barked, her own fear threatening to overwhelm her. We're almost there. The Astronovus loomed ahead, its battered hull a beacon of salvation. The ship was their only chance, but as they reached the airlock, a deafening roar split the air. The ground shook violently, and Elena turned to see the fissures widening, splitting apart as something massive began to rise from the depths. It was the monolith, or what the monolith had become. A vast, writhing shape, its surface a shifting amalgam of black metal and organic tendrils, reached upward toward the sky. It was alive, a towering manifestation of the entity's hunger, its many limbs spreading outward as though to grasp the stars themselves. And at its core, barely visible within the pulsing mass, was Nadia. Her crystalline body was embedded in the structure, her face frozen in a silent scream. Go! Elena shouted, shoving Jacob through the airlock. She slammed the door shut and raced to the cockpit, her fingers flying over the controls. The ship groaned as its engines roared to life, shaking against the gravitational pull of the entity. In the distance, she saw a blinding flash. Nadia had detonated the charges. The explosion was massive, a burst of light and energy that swallowed the alien structure and radiated outward across the moon. The shockwave hit the Astronovus, sending it lurching violently. Alarms blared and Elena gripped the controls, forcing the ship upward as debris rained down around them. For a moment, there was silence. Then the hum returned, faint but unmistakable. Elena stared out the viewport, her breath hitching in her throat. Below them, Charon was collapsing, its icy surface shattering as the entity consumed it from within. The light of the explosion had dimmed, but the tendrils remained, stretching hungrily toward the ship. "Did we stop it?" Jacob asked, his voice trembling. Elena didn't answer. She couldn't. The entity's hum resonated in her mind, a reminder that it wasn't truly gone. Not yet. As the Astronovus broke free of Charon's gravity and hurtled into the void, Elena set the autopilot and leaned back in her chair. The distress signal they had sent would reach Earth in weeks, maybe months. By then, humanity would know what they had uncovered, but whether they had truly stopped it or merely delayed the inevitable remained a question she couldn't answer. The hum followed her into her dreams, a soft, persistent reminder of what they had awoken and what might still come.